Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Janai and this is Karmic Fixer Tarot, and we're continuing our Jungian Deck study. I've got my source materials with me here, and we are working with the High Priestess this evening. We'll take a moment to look and drink her in for a second. Now please excuse my background here. Normally I have my green screen, but I'm using that as a shield against the heat, and it's really been helping to cool off my room. And again, back to our High Priestess. This was a very interesting card. This was a card I really enjoyed meditating with this week. And I have a bunch of notes that I do like to be as off the cuff as I can be. It's a little more natural. But I think in order to keep things a little more succinct, a little more organized, I think I have a bit of a script that I'm going to try to read from this week. And that script, of course, based on what I've been learning about the High Priestess from my source materials here. The Tarot Psychology book is kind of a shorter form overview of what the card represents in this deck. Then I have my larger book, Jungian Tarot and the Archetypal Imagery, or Images. It had a longer chapter on the High Priestess. It was a very interesting read. And yep, here she is again. And what I like to do, what I've been doing as I've been getting to know these cards, is I'll just sort of sit with the images and not necessarily think right away about the traditional interpretation. Now, again, the traditional interpretations are very important. I'm not saying discard those altogether. But as you're getting to know the cards and the deck, it might be more helpful to just kind of hone in on the images and see how they strike you. We've got her book there. We've got the different, we've got the mandala, the circular lights, the torches around her. We have the interesting sigil, the red, white, and blue sigil. There was the moon, the crescent on top, I think. You consider that a crescent. And there's also the inverted blue triangle, which represents water, typically in astrology. And this is a card that, particularly in this deck, the High Priestess is heavily representative of water, fluidity, movement, intuition. And what I like to do is set a timer for about 5 minutes, and that gives me about 5 minutes to just absorb the card before I try and begin meditating. So that's what I'm doing here. Just kind of taking in the images. And there's a lot to take in. So I hone in on the things that jump out at me the most. And one way that this particular High Priestess card is different to a lot of High Priestess cards, particularly the Rider-Waite Smith Coleman card. I had to put in my glasses there. That cut away should have been longer. But anyway, the fact that she is surrounded by water without being submerged in water is what jumps out to me the most. And that's quite different to, I'd say, the Rider-Waite Smith Coleman card, where she's sitting between two pillars and she seems to be in a religious environment, kind of an institutional environment, perhaps a church or whatnot, or a temple. But here her temple is the outdoors. Her temple is the water. There is the archway, but to me that I guess that's a little obscured or overtaken by the wateriness, if that's a word, of the imagery. The overwhelming appearance of the water, and everything in this card looked quite flowy, and I'll put the card back up on the screen in just a moment. I'm here just kind of taking it in. The watery imagery, the little torches around, which seem to be lights of understanding. There's something about the card that suggests spirituality, enlightenment, literal enlightenment with the torches, the little the circular mandala around her. And there's a serenity to this card. We take a look here and everything that's happening. She is pretty much completely surrounded by water. And this is very sort of, there's a serenity to everything that's happening. The sky is pretty dark, but it's got its multicolored streaks. the blue, the black, and the magenta, or the purple. I guess it's more of a purple than magenta. And the stars dotting the sky. It's not a scary image. It's not a scary sort of nighttime imagery. It looks very ritualistic to me. It looks like you're in holy ground, even though you're not indoors. Like there's a holy nature going on. If we look at the High Priestess, the imagery of what she's wearing, just slightly different to the Rider Waite Smith Coleman deck. Actually, now that I'm looking at this card again, um, I guess maybe the what I thought was like a inverted sort of crescent moon makes me think of perhaps the horns. Um, I'm going to refer very quickly to the Rider Waite Smith Coleman. Hmm. No, actually, that shares imagery with that traditional card. It's sort of crescent, the little crescent on top of the sigil. Um, that's very fascinating. So that's a parallel between the card there. Um, one general meaning that tends to be associated with the High Priestess is how this particular card represents intuitive wisdom, inner knowing, sort of spirituality, represents quiet reflection and getting in touch with one's intuition, getting in touch with the deeper truths, and getting to a place of trusting that inner knowing. So that tends to be the general meaning, the general interpretation of this particular major arcana card. And that's roughly about the same, I think, in Jungian tarot, but it's slightly different. When we think about this particular card in our archetypal series, the High Priestess represents the archetype of the daughter, and more specifically, the archetype of Anima, or the inner self of man. And I'll get into more of that in a moment. But thus far, if we think about the cards as we've been working with them over the past few weeks, and if you've been following, thank you so much for that. If not, you can definitely check out the playlist of the study of those particular cards. We've had the Empress in week 1, the archetype of the mother. We've had the Emperor in week 2, the archetype of the father. We've had the Magician, week 3, our previous week, is the archetype of the son. And now we have the High Priestess, which is the archetypical daughter. Now, it's interesting, I guess, the children slash siblings, the Magician and the High Priestess, what they have in common in this particular deck is how they represent animus slash anima. The Magician represented animus, kind of the inner self or the inner image of woman. Um, I guess the inner masculine side of a woman. Um, and again, we're speaking in terms of Jungian tech. I was about to say technology, Jungian psychology. As such, the High Priestess represents Anima, the inner self of man, as represented in this particular deck, is represented in Jungian psychology. Now, to be clear, I'm still learning the terminology. I'm still learning the significance of certain Jungian ideas as far as his psychology and how he explored those through tarot. His interpretations are slightly different to standard tarot. For example, this particular card in standard tarot, the High Priestess is generally associated with the moon. Her planetary slash luminary association tends to be the moon. And I think that's highly relevant, rather. In fact, I think that might be a little more relevant than the planet Neptune, which, based on the guidebook that came with this deck, that's the planetary representation of this particular High Priestess. And I guess I could see where Neptune would come in because Neptune is the planet of dreams, illusions, spirituality, um, the unknown, and mysteries. So I could see where that would be relevant to this particular card. But I think I lean a little bit more toward a traditional association of the moon with the High Priestess, as the moon has come to almost be an emblem of femininity when you're thinking of, say, the lunar cycle, or more specifically, its association with menstruation. And that might be alluded to in the sigil that we're looking at, the red, blue, and white sigil. Perhaps there's, the redness when you think of, menstruation and whatnot. And when we look at the little crescent at the top, or sitting at the top of the sigil, the crescent moon. And again, when you look at the center of the sigil, the blue inverted triangle, which tends to represent water. So I could see a significance between, or rather, a significance with both Neptune and the moon. So that's one thing to consider. I had the names and the planet of each card written on the cards because I've mentioned this in earlier videos that this was the first deck rather that I'd gotten as I'm learning tarot. This was the first deck that I bought. One thing that I would caution, I wouldn't necessarily use this particular deck as a first deck, because standard tarot tends to be more in line with the imagery and the symbolism of, say, the Rider-Waite-Smith-Coleman deck. But I think this is a very valuable deck for, you know, individuation, just kind of beginning self work, just kind of using the cards to be a mirror of your subconscious or your unconscious. That's kind of the way I use tarot. As someone who's not a psychologist, even though I'm very interested in psychology, I think this is a good deck to start introducing oneself to Jungian psychology and the way Jung incorporated the archetypes of the tarot. But as such, I don't know if this would be an ideal very first deck. So, as such, I wrote the name of each card and the planetary significance on the card. But for this study, I did kind of want to get back to the basics of the card, back to just the images. So I've whited out my writing. You might still be able to see some of my writing this week. The whiteout wasn't so clean, so I hope that's not too distracting. Or maybe I shouldn't have pointed that out to begin with. But anyway, we have the image of the High Priestess. I'm going to try and refer to some notes now because I took a lot of notes in exploring this card, and I really enjoyed, meditating with this card. Um, the the water, just the serenity that this card represented. To me, I found it very resonant. Now, getting back to some of, I guess, the Jungian significance of this card. Um, Again, this card represents Anima, the inner self of man, kind of the internal woman, the holder of secrets, which is symbolized by the book, kind of a book of deep secrets there. And also, if we take a look at this card, um, it also signifies one's outer mask or the persona, which, if we look at the card here, is pulled aside to reveal the true face of Anima. So it's almost as if this card is inviting us to remove our persona, to check our persona at the door. And if you look at the mask, I think the mask has a solidly masculine looking face. So perhaps if you are a male tarot reader, tarot enthusiast who's interacting with this card, perhaps for you, you might see the pulling away of the persona as, you know, putting aside, the outer sort of, masculine persona. Not to say that masculinity is a persona if you're a man, but let's veer away from that. But setting aside the persona to interact with the anima, the inner self of man, as represented by woman. And I think that's an interesting concept represented in the way that the mask is not really, it's kind of obscuring the face, but you can see more of the high priestess's face. I dare say kind of a glamorous imagery. And if we look at this particular card, this particular representation of the high priestess, at least in my opinion, I find to be more sensual than, I dare say, the Rider Waite Smith Coleman representation. One thing, there's the continuous robe, and there's the deep V neck, and the you know I think it's a little more than decolletage, but just kind of a sensuality of this card that suggests just kind of a more intimacy. It's less covered up than some of the other high priestesses as represented in other cards. If you think of, say, the Marseille Tarot, when you think of the major arcana card La Papesse, or the Lady Pope, who is the counterpart. I don't know if counterpart's the right word. The representation of High Priestess in that particular card, and in the Marseille deck, the Popes is very heavily covered up. So I think it's very interesting that when we study the High Priestess as Anima, in keeping with Jungian psychology, we have a very sensual High Priestess, which I think, again, very interesting. And the mask, kind of a way of looking at inner and outer personality. Now, if we meditate on this particular card, perhaps there is a sort of antagonistic femininity that is present in this card. When you think of this particular card as, I dare say, an antithesis to, just kind of what's considered masculine. We have a very feminine, very soft, very beautiful, very just sort of, you know, there's a softness and a serenity about this card. And I find that really interesting. So let me know what you think in the comments if you are a male tarot reader interacting with this card. What are some of your first impressions of your interaction with this card? What comes up for you as you're looking at this card? Now, the High Priestess has also come to be associated with virginity, just sort of a virginal, perhaps even idealized femininity, a sort of purity, which I think is very interesting. That might be an interesting thing to I don't know if confront is the word, but an interesting thing to interact with as we're looking at the cards here. Now, I don't necessarily want to get into the shadow side of this particular card, even though the shadow side of the High Priestess, you know, I might write that up in the bio. That could come straight from the little guidebook that comes with the book. You know, I'm really enjoying this deck, but one kind of caveat to this deck, I found as a new tarot reader, I found the guidebook to this deck a tiny bit confusing. If you're getting to know tarot for the first time, again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as a first deck, but a deck you could use if you want to do a little more kind of self reflection. If maybe you want to get deeper into kind of Jungian psychology, or sort of Jung's take on tarot. Um, but see, I'm veering away from my script, and I don't know what that tangent was. Anyway, let's see. Um, I guess going back to the interpretation of a sort of virginal consciousness. Um, the High Priestess has kind of been prominently um, related to just sort of the archetype of kind of a perpetual virginity. Um, I dare say, similar to the archetype of Animus with the magician, a sort of ability to create outside of, you know, outside of the traditional kind of procreation. We have the Empress, which represents motherhood, generally across the board when you're thinking of tarot. The Emperor as the strong kind of father dynamic, and the two of them come together and they create the son, the daughter. But the son and the daughter themselves represent the ability to create outside of you know the mother father traditional procreation sort of standard. And you know and the high priestess, I think her act of creation is just allowing one into the mysteries, the deeper mystery of self, kind of like a, oh, pardon me, I think I lost my train of thought. I think I was talking about the archetype of the high priestess as representing creativity, creation without um, procreative qualities that require the empress and the emperor together. I think the high priestess in tarot has come to signify just sort of has come to be similar to the archetype of, say, the Virgin Goddess, or when you think of, say, the Virgin Mary, just kind of divine creation, immaculate conception in some ways. And I think the High Priestess can represent just sort of the immaculate sort of creation of unity with God or the universe. And I think that comes through the the sort of spirituality, the sort of access to mystery, the access to that spiritual side that the high priestess represents. And she's holding the book of mysteries. She's surrounded by the lights of enlightenment. When I was dealing with this card, the inner landscape that I created was just kind of traversing the waters in the card with the high priestess, just kind of walking with her hand in hand. And if you see me here, I'm still kind of meditating on the card. Might seem like an odd imagery, but that's sort of how I work with the cards. I kind of have to, guide myself through the meditation. I might stick another cutaway here. Um, Perhaps that's a little distracting and jarring. But anyway, um, here I'm probably creating an inner landscape of working with the card. I'm just kind of walking through the water with the high priestess. I'm not noticing being submerged at a certain point, and just sort of being open to, spiritual enlightenment, open to inner knowing. And I think that's my timer. My timer has probably just gone off. I'm probably hearing the timer. I'm not wearing my glasses here. But yeah, for me, I found working with this card to be a very immersive experience, and I really enjoyed it. And I might write more about what I got out of this card, maybe in my Substack or maybe elsewhere. But hopefully, this was an invitation for you to work with this card. If you're interested in this deck, of course, you can probably find it on Amazon, or any other place where tarot decks are sold. And I hope you enjoyed this particular reading. I'm doing some grounding exercises here. It's kind of taking myself out of the moment. Maybe shaking myself loose, or if you're standing, maybe you can stand, maybe stamp your feet in the ground. I'm doing a few neck rolls. So far, out of all the cards, I found working with the High Priestess, at least for me, as the most immersive, even though this is a card that represents one's inner, I guess, one's inner female self. Oop, I'm being interrupted here. You don't live alone. That tends to happen. Shooing him away. Get out of here. But anyway, I enjoyed working with this card, and I think this is a good way to get to know one's deck. Just kind of allow yourself to be immersed with the deck. And these are my source materials. You don't necessarily have to get the source materials if you've got this deck, but I would recommend it. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Do let me know what you think in the comments, and until next week.